good evening, dear friends, and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you, wherever you're listening from tonight, maybe tucked safely under the blankets, curled up in your favorite quiet corner of the house, or perhaps lying somewhere peaceful. While the world slowly quiets down outside, I'm so happy you're here with me. Take a slow, gentle breath in. Let your shoulders soften and drop. Maybe pull the blanket or duvet up just a little higher, and allow the day to quietly drift away. London fog lay thick upon the city that autumn evening. At 221 B. Baker Street, Holmes sat idle, craving challenge. Then came the urgent knock at the door. Lady Victoria Hargrove, pale and trembling, burst in with news of tragedy. Her husband, Sir Reginald Hargrove, custodian of Kensington Palace artifacts, found dead in the palace's haunted gallery. A Scotland Yard saw a simple heart failure, perhaps from fright at the legendary apparition. But Holmes saw a link, the faint scent of bitter almonds on the victim's lips. One link in a chain that would bind a killer. The game is afoot. Chapter 1. The First Link. I set down these events as they occurred in the autumn of 1895, when the fogs of London lay especially thick and choking, wrapping the city in a gray shroud that muffled every sound and scent. Holmes and I had lately returned from a quiet week in the Surrey hills, and the consulting detective was restless, pacing before the coal fire in our sitting room at 221 B. Baker Street. The flames crackled cheerfully, throwing warm light across the scattered chemical apparatus, and the Stradivarius violin resting on its chair, while the air carried the rich, comforting smell of his strong tobacco mingled with the faint dampness that always seeped in from the foggy street below. Mrs. Hudson's knock came just as the mantel clock struck 8, her footsteps light, but hurried on the 17 worn stairs. She announced a lady visitor, and into the room stepped Lady Victoria Hargrove, her dark traveling cloak dripping with moisture, her face pale and drawn beneath the soft hiss of the gaslight. She clutched a folded newspaper, its edges curled from the wet night air, and sank into the armchair Holmes indicated with a courteous gesture. "My husband is dead, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low and trembling like the distant clatter of handsome wheels on wet cobblestones. "Sir Reginald Hargrove, custodian of the royal artifacts at Kensington Palace. They found him this morning in the Queen's Gallery, slumped at his desk, eyes wide with terror. Scotland Yard calls it heart failure, perhaps brought on by fright, but I cannot accept so simple an explanation." Holmes had seated himself opposite her, steepled fingers resting under his chin, eyes gleaming with that peculiar intense light I knew so well. "Details, Lady Hargrove. Begin at the beginning, and spare nothing, however small." The fire pulped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, while outside Big Ben tolled heavily through the mist. She drew a long breath, the scent of her lavender water briefly cutting through the coal smoke and tobacco. Reginald was preparing a special exhibition of Tudor relics, miniatures, jewels, a dagger once said to have belonged to Henry VIII himself. He often worked late, alone in the gallery. Last night, he stayed until past midnight. This morning, the footman, Bates, discovered him. No mark of violence, yet his expression was one of absolute horror, as though he had beheld something unearthly. They speak already of the apparition, the ghost of Anne Boleyn, said to wander those old halls, headless and weeping. I shifted in my chair, feeling the rough tweed of my sleeve brush the worn leather armrest. "This ghost, is the legend well established?" The room felt suddenly warmer from the fire, a sharp contrast to the bitter chill I could sense pressing against the window panes. "Centuries old, Dr. Watson," she answered, twisting her gloved hands. "Many have claimed to see her, always near the gallery or the privy chambers." Reginald dismissed such tales as nonsense, but of late he had grown uneasy. Anonymous letters arrived, warnings to cease meddling with the relics or face consequences. He burned them, but the last one came only 2 days ago. Scotland Yard sees no connection, but I believe someone wished him harm. Holmes rose in one swift motion, his shadow leaping tall against the wall. "We shall go to Kensington Palace at once. Watson, my Inverness and scarf." As we gathered our things, a soft rain began tapping insistently against the glass, matching the quickened beat of my own heart. The handsome cab rattled through the fog-bound streets, its wheels grinding over slick cobblestones that sent cold shocks up through the floorboards. The driver shouted warnings to shadowy pedestrians, his voice swallowed by the thick, acrid coal smoke drifting from 1,000 chimneys. The Thames mud smell grew stronger as we neared the palace, mingling with a faint trace of gunpowder from some distant celebration. Kensington Palace rose before us, its towers dim and ghostly in the mist, gaslights flickering like will-o'-the-wisps along the paths. Inspector Lestrade awaited us at the entrance, lantern in hand, casting long, wavering shadows. "Holmes, I might have known you'd turn up. It's a straightforward case. Overwork and a weak heart. No need for your theories." His breath clouded in the cold air, carrying the sharp tang of carbolic from his coat. Holmes brushed past without reply, leading us into the Queen's Gallery. The long room was hushed, lit only by a few hissing gas jets that threw golden pools across portraits and glass cases. The air was heavy with the musty odor of old leather bindings, polished oak, and something sweeter, aged wood and faint perfume. Sir Reginald's desk stood at the far end, papers scattered, an inkwell overturned, its black stain spreading like blood across the blotter. Holmes knelt at once, producing his magnifying glass. "The first link, Watson. Look here. Faint footprints in the dust near the desk. Small, feminine, with an uneven heel, as though the boot had been recently repaired on one side." He bent closer, nostrils flaring. "And a trace of carbolic soap clings to the carpet fibers, recent, distinct." He moved to the desk, lifting a handkerchief from beside the body's former position. "Observe the lips of the deceased. Faint, bluish tinge. And here, on this cloth, the unmistakable odor of bitter almonds. Cyanide, Watson, almost certainly administered in his evening tea." He indicated a porcelain cup, its rim chipped, interior stained faintly brown. A cold draught slipped through the tall windows, making me shiver. I could still taste the bitterness of the coffee I'd drunk earlier at Baker Street. "Poison, then. Not a ghost at all?" "Precisely," Holmes replied, drawing thoughtfully on his pipe, the tobacco smoke curling upward to join the fog that pressed against the panes. "The forge begins. The feminine prints do not belong to any servant. The tread is too delicate, too expensive. Combine that with the anonymous warnings. Someone sought to frighten Sir Reginald away from his work. A rival in the antiquarian world, perhaps, or a relative with designs on the estate." He paused, eyes half closed in recollection. "This puts me in mind of the speckled band affair. You remember, Watson, the young lady who heard a whistle in the night, a saucer of milk by the ventilator, a bed fixed to the floor. Everyone spoke of gypsies and supernatural vengeance. Yet the chain was simple: a trained snake, a bell rope that was no bell rope, and a stepfather desperate to retain his fortune. The evidence bound him as surely as iron. Here, too, the apparition is but a mask for human greed and poison. Therefore, he concluded, straightening, this is murder, staged to resemble the work of a restless spirit. The link forges strong, Watson. Did you see it form? The gallery seemed to echo with our voices, while distant footsteps of patrolling guards thudded softly like muffled heartbeats. Lady Hargrove waited near the door, her face lit by the warm glow of a bracket lamp. Holmes turned to her. Who had access to this room after hours? Family, staff. His brother, Lord Edmund, who has long envied the position and the income, she whispered. The maid Eliza, who brought his tea each evening. Mr. Thorne, the rival collector who quarreled with him over the dagger's authenticity. Bates, the footman who found him. And our ward, Miss Clara, who often studied the Tudor documents here. I committed the names to memory, already sensing the faint outline of a chain taking shape. Outside, foghorns moaned mournfully from the river, deepening the gothic chill of the night. Holmes gave a curt nod. Our starting points are clear. Note the textures, Watson. The smooth ivory handle of the dagger on the desk, the rough wool fibers caught in the cuff of the victim's coat. We departed as the rain grew heavier, soaking our coats and chilling us to the bone. Back at Baker Street, Holmes took up his violin, plucking soft, thoughtful notes that pierced the quiet. I sat by the fire with hot tea, its steam rising against the cold glass, reflecting on the evening's discoveries. Looking back, I should have seen the connection sooner. The first link had been forged. The chain begins. Chapter 2. Forging Connections. The following morning, the fog still hung heavy over Baker Street, thick enough to taste the damp coal smoke and the faint, sour mud of the Thames drifting up from the river. I awoke to the familiar clink of Mrs. Hudson's breakfast tray on the landing, followed by her steady tread up the 17 steps. The sitting room was already warm from the freshly stoked coal fire, its crackle a cheerful counterpoint to the muffled hansom wheels passing below. Holmes stood at the window, pipe in hand, staring into the gray murk as though he could read secrets in its swirls. "We begin forging the chain today, Watson," he said without turning. 4 locations, 4 interviews. Each will add a link, or reveal a flaw. He reached into the Persian slipper for a fresh pinch of tobacco, the rich scent blooming as he tamped it down. Our first call was Hargrove Manor in Mayfair. The cab rattled briskly along Park Lane, wheels grinding over wet cobblestones that sent up cold sprays against the apron. We were shown into a somber drawing room where a bright fire burned, its heat welcome against the chill that clung to our coats. Lord Edmund Hargrove rose from a deep leather armchair, cigar already alight, the blue smoke curling thickly around his heavy features. "Gentlemen," he said gruffly, voice deep as distant thunder, "my brother's death is misfortune enough without detectives turning it into melodrama. Heart failed, simple as that. He buried himself in those cursed relics day and night." Holmes settled into the opposite chair, the smooth leather creaking under him. "Your whereabouts on the night in question, Lord Edmund?" The fire popped, sending a spark skittering across the hearth. "At my club in St. James's Street, as always on Tuesdays. A dozen men can vouch for me." He drew deeply on the cigar, the tip glowing red. Reginald was obsessed. The palace ghost stories amused him once. Lately, they seemed to prey on his mind. Anonymous notes, he said, childish threats. I told him to burn them and be done. I noted the man's gold watch chain glinting against his waistcoat, the cufflinks polished to mirror brightness. The room smelled of cigar tobacco, and old leather bindings from the shelves, and the faint, sweet trace of brandy on the side table. Outside, rain began tapping the tall windows like impatient fingers. Our next destination was Mr. Thorne's antiquarian shop in narrow, book-lined streets of Bloomsbury. The hansom lurched over uneven paving, the driver calling sharp warnings through the fog. A small bell tinkled as we entered. The air inside was close, heavy with the musty odor of aged paper, leather bindings, and a trace of carbolic used to preserve old vellum. Mr. Thorne, thin and bespectacled, looked up from behind a cluttered counter, his fingers twitching on a quill. Sir Reginald and I disagreed about provenance. Nothing more, he said quickly, voice high and precise like a violin string drawn tight. That dagger? Tudor, yes, but not Henry's personal weapon. A copy, as skillfully made. He refused to listen. Holmes wandered to a glass case, tracing a finger along the cold surface. You keep historical curiosities, I see, including specimens of old poisons. The shop's small grate crackled faintly, barely warming the damp that had followed us in. Empty files only. Museum pieces, Thorne protested, cheeks flushing. I would never. He broke off, glancing at the door as though expecting interruption. Big Ben's deep chime rolled through the fog outside, marking noon. We pressed on to the servants' quarters near Kensington Gardens. The cab deposited us at a modest brick building, half hidden by dripping plane trees. Eliza the maid received us in a tiny parlor, where a penny fire sputtered in the grate. The room smelled strongly of carbolic soap and damp wool. Her apron was starched stiff, a rough to the touch when she nervously smoothed it. I brought Sir Reginald his tea every evening at 9, she said softly, eyes downcast. Last night, he dismissed me early, said he wished to work undisturbed. I left the tray and went. Her small hands twisted together. I noticed her boots, neat, black, one heel slightly built up. "And the ghost?" Holmes asked, leaning forward. Rain drummed steadily on the slate roof above. "I've seen something," she whispered. "A white figure in the gallery once, but it moved too quickly for any spirit." Her voice trembled. The fire gave a sudden pop, startling us all. Our final visit took us across the river to a quiet boarding house in Chelsea. The bridge crossing was slow, foghorns moaning mournfully from the water below. Miss Clara received us in a small sitting room, scented with fresh chrysanthemums that almost masked the underlying coal smoke from the street. She was young, perhaps 22, with bright auburn hair, pinned neatly and steady hazel eyes. Uncle Reginald was strict but kind, she said, fingering a small silver locket whose metal felt cool and smooth under my brief glance. I often used the palace library for my Tudor studies. He encouraged me. She offered us tea. The cup was hot against my palms, its bitter flavor sharp on the tongue. "Did you know of the threatening letters?" Holmes inquired, watching her closely. No, but he had grown anxious these last weeks. He spoke once of someone wanting the dagger sold abroad. Her voice was clear, composed, yet I sensed a guarded edge. Back at Baker Street, as twilight deepened, the gas jets hissed to life, and the fire roared afresh against the encroaching cold. Holmes paced rapidly before the hearth, pipe smoke trailing behind him like a comet's tail. "Links are forming, Watson. Edmund's convenient alibi and financial strain. Thorne's knowledge of poisons and professional grudge, Eliza's access and peculiar boots, Clara's presence and calm demeanor. Yet something does not yet join cleanly. I sank into my chair, feeling the worn leather warm against my back, and sipped the sweet brandy Holmes had poured. The rain had eased to a soft patter. Distant footsteps echoed on the wet pavement below. Looking back, I should have forged more of the chain myself that day. The connections were multiplying. Links forging. The chain takes shape. Chapter 3. The chain grows dawn, came gray and reluctant. The fog still thick enough to carry the damp, earthy scent of overnight rain, mixed with the ever-present coal smoke of London's chimneys. At 221 B. Baker Street, I stirred to the soft, mournful plucking of Holmes's violin strings, slow, deliberate notes that seemed to draw secrets from the very air. Mrs. Hudson ascended with breakfast, the tray clinking gently. The hot tea steamed against the chill that clung to the window panes, where frost had traced delicate, feathery patterns overnight. "We returned to Kensington Palace this morning, Watson," Holmes announced, setting the instrument aside. "The chain requires reinforcement before it can be tested." He reached for his pipe, the rich tobacco aroma blooming as he filled it from the Persian slipper. The fire crackled vigorously in the grate, and its warmth a welcome shield against the bitter cold outside. The hansom cab rattled us through Hyde Park, wheels crunching over wet gravel paths, splashing through shallow puddles that reflected the pale morning gaslights still burning. The scent of sodden leaves and distant river mud grew stronger as we approached Kensington Palace. Guards admitted us with nods. Their heavy boots thudded on stone flags as they led us once more to the Queen's Gallery. The long room felt colder than before, almost morgue-like, the air heavy with old polished wood, faint gunpowder traces from some long-ago salute, and the musty undertone of centuries-old tapestries. Holmes went directly to Sir Reginald's desk, producing his lens. He crouched, examining the underside of the drawer. "Here is our next link," he said quietly. "A concealed compartment. Newly scratched, see these fine parallel marks. Not made by any tool, but by fingernails painted with red lacquer, and clinging to the wood a trace of perfume, lavender sharpened with rose." He sniffed delicately, then straightened. "The forge. Such lacquer is uncommon among servants, yet Eliza's hands bear no polish. Clara, however, favors red nails, and that exact scent." I felt the cold marble of a nearby bust under my palm, smooth, unyielding, chilling my fingers. "You suspect collaboration?" "Precisely. The feminine footprints we noted yesterday match Eliza's boots in size, yet the perfume belongs to Clara. 2 women, one purpose, to frighten Sir Reginald away from something in that compartment." Holmes moved to the floor again, lifting a small flake of white fabric caught in a crack. "And this scrap of muslin, treated with phosphorus traces, enough to glow faintly in the dark." The gas jets hissed overhead, throwing wavering shadows across the portraits. Outside, rain began once more, a steady patter against the tall windows like restless fingertips. I tasted the lingering bitterness of breakfast coffee on my tongue, sharp against the growing excitement. "This puts me in mind of the second stain," Holmes continued, eyes distant. "You recall the affair, Watson. The Prime Minister's urgent letter vanished from a locked dispatch box in his own house. Everyone spoke of foreign spies and treachery, yet the chain was domestic. A single carpet fiber caught in the hinge, a droplet of green wax on the floor, a misplaced paper knife with a fresh nick. Lady Hilda had hidden the document to shield her husband from scandal. But the true thief, a desperate blackmailer, had exploited her fear. The links bound him inexorably once observed. No international conspiracy, only human weakness and calculation. So here, the ghost is staged, the poison real, and the compartment the true prize. Therefore, he concluded, pocketing the fabric scrap, someone wished to remove evidence of the dagger's dubious provenance, perhaps papers proving it a modern forgery, worth far less than Sir Reginald believed. Theft masked as supernatural murder. The chain grows, Watson. Did you feel the links connect? We searched further. Beneath a loose floorboard near the window, pried up with a faint creak, we found a crumpled note. Ink still fresh enough to smell faintly of iron gall. The message was brief. Cease, or the Queen's wrath will find you. Holmes held it to the light. The paper bore the watermark of Thorne's shop stationery. Lestrade arrived then, his coat dripping, boots leaving wet prints on the parquet. "Still chasing ghosts, Holmes?" he asked gruffly. The inspector's lantern swung, casting long beams that danced across the walls. "Hardly," Holmes replied. "We chase a forger and a poisoner. This note links Thorne directly." The rain drummed harder, wind rattling the panes. We climbed next to the palace attics by a narrow servant's stair, each step groaning under our weight. The air up there was colder still, thick with dust, and the musty smell of old costumes stored in cedar chests. Holmes lifted a white gown from a rack, gauzy, theatrical, one sleeve torn. He sniffed the hem. Gunpowder residue, small charges sewn in to create flashes and noise, enough to terrify a man alone at night. I shivered. The attic chill seeped through my coat, contrasting the warm fire we had left behind at Baker Street. So the apparition was manufactured, complete with sound and light. Exactly. Eliza and Clara together, perhaps, believing they only meant to frighten him into abandoning the exhibition. But someone else seized the opportunity to slip cyanide into his tea. Holmes folded the gown carefully. The chain lengthens. Downstairs again, in the palace library, shelves of leather-bound volumes exhaling their ancient odor, we found Clara's research ledger open on a table. Annotations in her neat hand detailed Tudor poisons, including cyanide compounds. Holmes closed it with a soft snap. "Another thread," he murmured. She studied the means as well as the history. Big Ben tolled distantly through the fog, its deep notes vibrating the glass. The pieces were joining faster now. I could almost feel the chain taking weight in my mind. You, dear reader, may already have begun to suspect where the strongest link lies. Back at 221B that evening, as gas jets hissed and the fire roared against the encroaching dark, Holmes paced before the hearth, pipe smoke trailing. The parallels deepen, like Jonathan Small in The Sign of 4, years of brooding vengeance, a map, a poisoned dart, all chained to one glittering motive. Here, too, history and greed entwine. I sat with hot tea warming my hands, the steam rising against the cold panes, reflecting on how blind I had been to some connections. The chain grows stronger. Logic binds. Chapter 4. Testing the links. The fog had thinned by midday, but still clung to the streets of London, carrying the sharp bite of coal smoke and the damp chill that made every cobblestone slick underfoot. At 2:21, B. Baker Street, the fire burned low, its crackle subdued. The room smelled faintly of Holmes's morning experiment, carbolic mingled with tobacco, and the hot tea Mrs. Hudson had left steaming on the side table. I sipped from my cup, the bitter warmth steadying me against the cold drafts that slipped past the window frames. "Today, we test the chain, Watson," Holmes declared, rising from his chair. "Theory must yield to experiment. Weak links will snap. The strong will hold." He drew on his pipe thoughtfully, the smoke curling upward like a question mark, then reached for his Inverness. "We begin with the most accessible suspect." Our first stop was the servants' quarters near Kensington Gardens. The hansom cab rattled briskly along Kensington Road, wheels grinding over wet stones, splashing through shallow puddles that reflected the pale gaslight still lit in the midday gloom. Eliza answered our knock herself, apron dusted with flour, eyes widening at the sight of us. "Mr. Holmes, doctor," she began, voice soft and unsteady. The small parlor behind her smelled strongly of carbolic soap and fresh-baked bread. A penny fire sputtered in the grate, barely warming the chill room. Holmes stepped inside without ceremony. "The scratches beneath the desk compartment, Eliza. Red lacquer from fingernails. Your hands are unpainted." She flushed, twisting the rough cotton of her apron between her fingers. I only helped Miss Clara once or twice. She asked me to fetch things from the gallery when Sir Reginald was out. I never touched his private papers. And the white gown in the attic," Holmes pressed gently. "Phosphorus traces, gunpowder, theatrical tricks." Tears welled. We only wanted to frighten him a little, to make him stop the exhibition. The dagger was going to be sold abroad. Miss Clara said it belonged in England. We never meant harm. Her small boots, neat, one heel repaired, shifted nervously on the worn rug. "I swear I never poisoned his tea." Holmes nodded once. "Your link holds, for now. Fear, not murder." We took another cab to Bloomsbury. Mr. Thorne's shop bell tinkled sharply as we entered. The air was thick with dust, old leather, and the faint metallic tang of ink. Thorne looked up from a ledger, spectacles slipping down his nose. "The ink on the warning notes," Holmes began without preamble, producing the crumpled paper from his pocket. "Your own stock, same watermark, same iron gall scent." Thorne paled. "I sell to half the scholars in London. Anyone could have bought it." His fingers drummed the smooth wood of the counter. "And the cyanide file in your collection, recently opened, a measure missing. I experiment with restorations," Thorne stammered. "Historical accuracy. I never—" He broke off, glancing at the small grate where a fire crackled feebly. "Very well. Sir Reginald threatened to expose my forgeries. I wrote one note, only one, to scare him off. But poison? Never." Holmes studied him a long moment. "Your link bends but does not break. Malice, not murder." Next, we rattled to St. James's. Lord Edmund's club was warm and hushed, smelling of rich cigar tobacco, polished leather, and sweet brandy. He received us in a corner alcove, face flushed from the fire and perhaps the glass in his hand. "Your alibi," Holmes said quietly. "You left the club at 8:40, returned at 9:10, 20 minutes unaccounted for." Edmund set the glass down hard. "A brief walk, clearing my head. Nothing more. Time enough to reach Kensington Palace by cab, administer a dose to a teacup, and return." Holmes observed. "Your hunting gloves, leather, gunpowder scented, left a smudge on the cup handle." The man's jaw tightened. Preposterous. I was nowhere near the palace. Yet his cigar trembled slightly. The blue smoke curled uncertainly. "Your link strains," Holmes said. "We shall see." Our final test took us to Chelsea. Miss Clara's boarding-house parlor was bright with chrysanthemums, their clean scent almost masking the coal smoke drifting in from the street. She stood as we entered, locket glinting at her throat, cool metal catching the gaslight. "The perfume in the compartment," Holmes began. "Yours. The lacquer on the scratches. Yours. The ledger notes on poisons. Yours." Clara lifted her chin. "I helped Eliza stage the apparition, yes, to protect the collection. But the poison—" Her voice faltered. "I brought Uncle Reginald a fresh pot of tea that night. I left it on the tray. Someone else must have—" She broke off, eyes filling. Holmes regarded her steadily. "Your link is strong in intent, yet fragile in act. Accessory, perhaps, not principal." Back at Baker Street as evening drew in, the gas jets hissed softly and the fire had been built up again, its heat welcome against the gathering cold. Holmes paced before the hearth, pipe in hand, tobacco smoke trailing. 4 tests, Watson. Eliza and Clara conspired to frighten, red herring, but innocent of murder. Thorne wrote 1 note, malice without lethal intent. Edmund's absence and the glove smudge remain the firmest links. The others bend or snap under pressure. I sank into my chair, feeling the worn leather warm against my back, and accepted the glass of sweet brandy he offered. The rain had returned, tapping insistently at the panes. Distant footsteps splashed along the wet pavement below. Looking back, some of the weaker connections should have broken sooner in my own mind. Yet the process had clarified the chain, discarding the false from the true. Weak links shattered. The true chain emerges. Chapter 5. The chain tightens. Dusk fell early that November evening. The fog rolling in thick from the river, carrying the heavy, brackish smell of Thames mud, mingled with the acrid bite of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys. At 221 B. Baker Street, the fire roared against the encroaching chill, its crackle sharp and steady, while gas jets hissed softly along the walls. Holmes had spent the afternoon poring over timetables and club registers. Now he stood abruptly, eyes alight with that peculiar gleam. "The chain has reached sufficient length, Watson," he said, reaching for his coat. "One suspect remains whose movements do not align. We move tonight." He drew on his pipe once, the rich tobacco smoke curling upward, then tucked a small electric torch, newly acquired from a scientific supplier, into his pocket. A telegram had arrived an hour earlier, its paper still crisp and faintly scented with ink. Miss Clara had left her Chelsea lodgings in haste, direction unknown. Holmes interpreted the flight correctly. She knows more than she confessed. If she runs, she leads us to the principal, or to evidence that binds him. We took a hansom through the gathering dark, wheels rumbling loudly over the wet cobblestones of Sloane Street, the horses' hooves clattering in urgent rhythm. Foghorns moaned mournfully from the river. Big Ben tolled the half-hour with deep, vibrating notes that seemed to shake the mist itself. We alighted near Kensington Gardens just as the palace gates came into view, their iron bars cold and slick under my gloved hand. A figure in a dark cloak slipped through a side path, moving quickly toward the ornamental lake. Holmes touched my arm. "There. Follow quietly." We moved forward on foot, boots crunching softly on gravel, the fog muffling every sound. The figure, Clara, unmistakably, halted near the Serpentine's edge, glancing back as though sensing pursuit. Rain began again, a fine, cold drizzle that pattered on leaves and soaked through our coats. Holmes stepped forward. "Miss Clara," he called, voice low but carrying. "There is no escape now. The chain has tightened." She whirled, cloak billowing like a ghost's shroud. For a moment she stood frozen, then turned and ran along the path, skirts catching on wet bracken. We gave chase, Holmes ahead, long strides eating distance. I followed, breath coming hard in the damp air. Her footsteps splashed through puddles. Ours answered in pursuit. The fog swallowed the palace lights behind us, leaving only the dim glow of distant gas lamps and the black mirror of the water. She stumbled near a cluster of willows, cloak snagging on a branch. Holmes reached her first, catching her arm, not roughly, but firmly. The rough wool of her sleeve was soaked and cold under his grip. "Why run?" he asked, voice calm amid the rain's steady drum. Tears mixed with rain on her face. "I didn't kill him. Eliza and I only meant to frighten Uncle Reginald, to stop him selling the dagger to foreigners. We dressed as the apparition, used flash powder, made noises in the attics. But someone used our trick to poison him." Holmes released her gently. "And the tea you carried that night?" "I left the pot on the tray, untouched, I swear it." Her voice broke. From the locket at her throat she drew a small glass vial. Empty now, but once stoppered. "I kept almond essence here, to mask any odd taste if he noticed. But I never added poison." I felt the chill of the night deepen into my bones, contrasting the warm fire we had left behind. Holmes examined the vial under the faint beam of his torch. Empty. A red herring, then. But the chain does not break here. We returned with Clara to the palace under escort, 2 constables summoned by a passing patrol. In the Queen's gallery once more, the room felt colder than ever, gas jets hissing like angry serpents. Holmes relit the hearth. Flames leapt up, casting warm light across the desk and warming our chilled hands. He took the teacup from its saucer, turning it carefully. "The final link," he said. "Observe the handle. Faint smudge of leather scented with gunpowder and cigar smoke. Not a lady's glove. Lord Edmund's hunting pair, kept at his club, used on his brief errand that night." Clara gave a small gasp. "Uncle Edmund, but he was at his club. Long enough absent to reach here by cab," Holmes replied. "He knew of your little charade, perhaps overheard Eliza. He seized the opportunity, arrived during the staged fright, slipped cyanide into the fresh pot you had left, then returned to his alibi. The apparition became his perfect cover." The fire crackled louder, sparks dancing up the chimney. I tasted the sharp bitterness of discovery, like strong coffee swallowed too quickly. Holmes turned to Clara. "You are accessory to deception, but not to murder. Your link is accessory, breakable with truth." Lestrade arrived soon after, summoned by another telegram, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor. Holmes laid out the evidence methodically. The glove smudge, the 20-minute gap, the gunpowder scent matching Edmund's sporting habits, the inheritance debts uncovered in the morning's inquiries. "It reminds me of the Boscombe Valley case," Holmes said quietly, eyes on the flames. A dying man's last word, "rat," seemed meaningless delirium. Yet it chained to an old Australian quarrel, blackmail, a hidden past. The weapon was no boomerang, but a heavy stick. The true killer struck in rage and fear, leaving the innocent son accused. Observation and logic freed him, binding the guilty. Here, too, the ghost was a mask, the poison the act, the motive cold and financial. Edmund administered the dose himself, Holmes concluded. The bind is complete. The chain tightens around him, Watson. No escape now. Outside, the rain drummed harder, a foghorns sounding like a dirge across the dark water. Clara stood silent, shivering despite the fire's warmth. Lestrade nodded grimly. I'll have men at Hargrove Manor by dawn. The lynx had joined at last. The weight of truth pressed heavily in the quiet gallery. Looking back, I should have seen Edmund's absence as the pivotal flaw sooner. The chain tightens. No escape now. Chapter 6. Links to the Past. Morning light struggled through the persistent fog, turning Baker Street into a world of soft grays and muted gaslight. The coal smoke from neighboring chimneys drifted lazily past our windows, carrying the familiar acrid tang that mingled with the rich tobacco. Holmes was already drawing from his pipe. At 221B, the fire had been freshly stoked. Its steady crackle filled the sitting room while Mrs. Hudson's footsteps retreated down the 17 stairs after delivering breakfast. The hot tea steamed gently, its bitter edge sharp on my tongue against the chill that still clung to the panes. The criminal's history must now be laid bare, Watson, Holmes said, setting aside a sheaf of notes he had received by early post. A motive is the strongest link of all, but it often hides in the past. Today, we dig there. He rose, coat already over his arm, eyes bright with purpose. Our first destination was the British Museum reading room, reached by hansom through streets still slick from overnight rain. The cab's wheels rumbled over cobblestones, splashing cold water against the apron. The driver's whip cracked sharply above the horse's back. Inside the great domed room, the air was thick with the musty scent of old paper and leather bindings, warmed faintly by gas radiators that hissed like distant serpents. Holmes consulted directories and ledgers with swift precision, his long fingers turning pages that rustled softly. "Here," he murmured after 20 minutes. Lord Edmund Hargrove, debts totaling nearly £12,000, accumulated over 3 years at gaming tables and private loans. Several entries note pawned family silver and minor artworks. Reginald refused to cover the losses last spring, insisting Edmund sell his own estate instead. I felt the smooth, cool surface of the reading table under my palms. So, the inheritance from Sir Reginald would clear those debts at a stroke. Precisely. And more. Edmund had quietly approached several dealers, including Thorne, offering Tudor pieces from the family collection for quick sale. Reginald discovered this. Family letters confirm a violent quarrel 6 weeks ago. Holmes closed the ledger with a soft snap. Outside, Big Ben tolled the hour, its deep notes vibrating through the thick stone walls. We moved next to Thorne's shop in Bloomsbury. The bell tinkled as we entered. The familiar odor of aged vellum, dust, and faint carbolic greeted us. Thorne looked up from polishing a brass astrolabe, his spectacles catching the weak light from the small grate, where a fire crackled low. "You sold forged pieces to Lord Edmund," Holmes stated without preamble. "And you knew the dagger Sir Reginald prized was likewise suspect." Thorne's hands stilled. "I supplied him with several items over 2 years. He needed funds desperately, creditors pressing. The dagger he never bought from me. He inherited it. But yes, as I warned him privately that Reginald's authentication was overly optimistic. Edmund laughed, said his brother was blind to anything that didn't flatter the family name. And when Reginald threatened to expose your forgeries," Holmes leaned closer, voice low amid the quiet rustle of turning pages from other patrons. Thorne swallowed. "I wrote one note, only one, to frighten him into silence. But Edmund, he spoke of handling the matter if Reginald persisted. I thought he meant lawyers." The fire popped, sending a spark skittering across the hearth. The warmth barely reached the chill that had settled in my bones. From there, we returned to Kensington Palace, where Eliza waited in the servants' hall. The room smelled of fresh laundry starch and carbolic soap. A small fire burned in the range, its heat welcome against the drafts that slipped under doors. Eliza's hands trembled as she poured tea, cups clinking softly on saucers. "Lord Edmund knew of our plan," she whispered. "He overheard me and Miss Clara in the attics one evening, discussing the gown and the flash powder. He said nothing then, only smiled. Later, he asked me privately if the ghost would appear again soon. I thought he was mocking us." Holmes nodded slowly. "He used your deception as cover. The staged fright would explain any terror on Sir Reginald's face, perfect camouflage for poison." Eliza dabbed her eyes with a rough cotton handkerchief. "I never imagined. I only wanted to keep the relics here, for England." All threads now joined. Edmund's debts chained him to desperation. His secret dealings with Thorne provided knowledge of poisons. The overheard plot supplied opportunity. The ghost was never the killer's invention. It was borrowed, turned lethal by one cold, calculating mind. Back at 221B, as twilight deepened, the gas jets hissed to life, and the fire had been built high, its flames dancing across the walls. Holmes paced before the hearth, pipe in hand, tobacco smoke trailing in thoughtful spirals. "This case echoes the Greek interpreter," he reflected aloud. "You remember Melas, the harmless translator drawn into abduction and coercion. The chain there stretched across years and continents. Sophie's captivity, her brother's greed, forced signatures on documents, all bound by invisible threads of family and money. The deaf-mute signals, the sealed room, the chloroform traces, each link forged in secrecy until observation revealed the whole. Here, too, past extravagance, present debt, future inheritance. The apparition was but the final knot in Edmund's design. I sat in my usual chair, feeling the worn leather warm against my back, and sipped the sweet brandy Holmes had poured. The rain had eased to a soft patter. Distant footsteps splashed along the wet pavement below. Looking back, the motive had been there from the beginning, hidden behind bluster and alibis, waiting only for the past to be unearthed. Past and present, one unbroken chain. Chapter 7. The Complete Chain. Evening had fallen heavily over Baker Street, the fog pressing thick against the window panes like a living thing, carrying the damp chill and the ever-present bite of coal smoke from the city beyond. At 221B, the coal fire roared in the grate, its crackle sharp and steady, throwing warm, golden light across the familiar clutter of chemical apparatus, violin case, and worn leather chairs. Mrs. Hudson had just cleared the supper things, her footsteps fading down the 17 stairs, when a series of heavy knocks announced the arrival of our guests. Lestrade entered first, coat dripping, followed by Lord Edmund Hargrove, flanked by 2 constables, then Lady Victoria, pale but composed, Miss Clara, eyes downcast, Eliza twisting her apron, and finally Mr. Thorne, spectacles fogged from the mist outside. The room filled quickly with the mingled scents of wet wool, cigar tobacco still clinging to Edmund's coat, lavender from Lady Victoria, and the faint carbolic that seemed to follow Eliza everywhere. Holmes stood before the fire, tall and calm, pipe in hand but unlit for once. He waited until all were seated, some on chairs dragged from the bedroom, others standing awkwardly, before he spoke. "Gentlemen and ladies," he began, voice low yet carrying clearly over the fire's crackle and the soft hiss of gas jets. "Tonight, the chain is complete. Every link forged, tested, and bound. I shall lay it out piece by piece so that no doubt remains." He turned first to the physical evidence. The footprints in the gallery dust, small, feminine, uneven heel, belonged to Eliza, used during the staged apparition with Miss Clara. But the decisive mark was on the teacup handle, a smudge of glove leather, scented with gunpowder and cigar smoke. Lord Edmund's hunting gloves, kept at his club. The cup itself bore traces of cyanide, bitter almonds lingering on the handkerchief. And a second, a subtler residue of almond essence meant to mask any odd taste. That essence came from Miss Clara's locket vial, empty now, but once used innocently to flavor tea. The compartment beneath the desk showed fresh scratches from red-lacquered nails, Clara's, and carried her perfume. The white gown in the attic held phosphorus and gunpowder for flashes, another element of the deception. These physical links form the first strong segment. Deception staged by two, murder executed by one. He moved to the timeline. Sir Reginald received his tea at 9. Eliza left early at his request. Clara delivered a fresh pot shortly after, then departed. Lord Edmund's club register shows him absent from 8:40 to 9:10, a 30-minute window. A hansom from St. James's to Kensington takes 12 minutes in clear traffic. A fog that night slowed it only slightly. He had time to enter by a side door he knew well, dose the pot while the women's ghost distracted his brother, and return. The anonymous notes, one in Thorne's ink, others in Edmund's disguised hand, were sent over weeks to build fear. Timeline links bind the opportunity squarely to Edmund. Next came the witnesses. Eliza confesses the apparition plot, meant only to frighten, never to kill. Miss Clara admits her part, driven by loyalty to the collection and family pride. Bates, the footman, saw a white figure but heard human footsteps, not spectral gliding. Thorne admits writing one warning note and selling forgeries to Edmund, but denies murder. Lady Victoria confirms the growing tension between brothers. Every witness statement once aligned, points away from themselves and toward the one man who profited most. Motive followed. Lord Edmund's debts, nearly £12,000, documented at the British Museum and confirmed by bankers, threatened ruin. Reginald refused to further aid, insisting Edmund sell his own lands. The Tudor dagger, if authenticated as royal, would fetch a fortune at auction. If exposed as suspect, far less. Edmund had already pawned family pieces through Thorne. Reginald's death placed the entire estate and collection under Edmund's control, debts cleared, artifacts sold at his discretion. Motive links are iron, greed, desperation, and long-simmering resentment. Finally, Holmes stepped closer to Edmund. The connecting link, the one that binds all others, is your own hand. The last warning note, found beneath the floorboard, bears traces of your cigar ash embedded in the fibers and your characteristic pressure on the pen, visible under magnification. You overheard the women's plan, borrowed their ghost, and turned it lethal. When you learned Reginald planned to sell the dagger abroad, removing your chance at quick profit, you acted. Edmund's face had drained of color. His hands clenched on the chair arms, knuckles white against the leather. "This is madness," he rasped. Coincidence, nothing more. Holmes regarded him steadily. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The impossible is a ghost-wielding poison. What remains is you. Silence fell. broken only by the fire's steady crackle and the soft drip of fog-condensed water against the panes. Lestrade stepped forward, nodding to his men. "Lord Edmund Hargrove, I arrest you for the murder of Sir Reginald Hargrove." Edmund surged to his feet, chair scraping back. "You have no proof, only theories." But his voice cracked. The bluster was gone. The constables moved smoothly, one taking each arm. Handcuffs clicked shut. Cold iron against skin, the metallic sound sharp in the warm room. Lady Victoria turned away, a handkerchief to her lips. Clara stood frozen, tears silent on her cheeks. Eliza whispered, "I never meant—" Thorne shrank back against the wall. Holmes spoke once more, quietly. Every link accounted for. Motive, means, opportunity, deception, execution, all forged in logic, tested by evidence, bound by truth. The chain is complete. Lestrade touched his hat. "Well done, Mr. Holmes. We'll take him to the yard." The group filed out, Edmund between the constables. Head bowed now, leaving the room suddenly still, the fire's warmth almost too much after the chill truth it had illuminated. I sank into my chair, feeling the worn leather creak beneath me, and accepted the brandy Holmes poured without a word. The rain pattered softly outside. Distant footsteps faded along the wet pavement. Looking back, the chain had been forming since that first evening, link by link, invisible until the final piece locked it tight. Every link accounted for. The chain complete. Chapter 8. Justice in Chains. Dawn broke cold and clear over Mayfair. The fog of the previous nights finally lifted, leaving only a thin, damp mist that carried the sharp scent of wet coal smoke and the faint, earthy tang of the park gardens. At Hargrove Manor, the great iron gates stood open. Lestrade's men had arrived before first light, their boots crunching on gravel paths, still slick from overnight dew. I rode with Holmes in a hansom cab that rattled briskly along the quiet streets, wheels grinding over cobblestones that echoed louder in the crisp morning air. The driver's whip cracked once. The horse snorted plumes of white breath into the chill. We alighted at the manor steps, just as the constables formed a quiet cordon around the entrance. Lady Victoria waited in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her face pale but composed, beneath the weak sunlight filtering through bare plane trees. Inside, the hall smelled of polished oak, lingering cigar smoke, and the faint, carbolic trace that seemed to follow the household even now. Lord Edmund descended the grand staircase slowly, still in dressing gown and slippers, hair disheveled, eyes hollow from a sleepless night. Lestrade stepped forward, warrant in hand, voice formal but not unkind. "Lord Edmund Hargrove, you are under arrest for the wilful murder of Sir Reginald Hargrove by poison. Anything you say will be taken down, and may be given in evidence." Edmund halted on the bottom step, one hand gripping the banister so tightly the knuckles showed white against the dark wood. For a moment he said nothing. Then a harsh, broken laugh escaped him. "You think chains will hold me? I did what any man would, protected what was mine. Reginald was squandering our legacy on foreigners. The dagger alone would have cleared every debt. He refused to see reason." His voice cracked on the last word. The constables moved up quietly, one on each side. Edmund's gaze darted to Holmes, standing silent near the doorway, Inverness still buttoned against the morning cold. "You," Edmund rasped, pointing a trembling finger. "You and your infernal chains. Every step I took, you traced. Every lie I told, you unraveled. How?" Holmes met his eyes without flinching. "Observation, my lord. The glove smudge on the cup. The 20-minute absence from your club? The cigar ash pressed into the final note. Link by link, the truth binds tighter than any manacle. You forged your own fetters. Edmund's shoulders sagged. The constables closed the cuffs, cold iron clicking shut with a final metallic snap that echoed in the high hall. He did not resist. As they led him toward the waiting police van outside, he paused once at the threshold, turning back to Lady Victoria. "Forgive me, Victoria," he whispered. "I only wanted security." She did not answer, only turned her face away, shawl drawn tighter. The van doors closed with a heavy thud. The horses stamped impatiently, harness jingling. The vehicle rolled away down the drive, wheels crunching gravel until the sound faded into the morning quiet. Back at Scotland Yard later that morning, Lestrade received us in his small office, the air thick with tobacco smoke from his pipe, and the faint smell of ink and old paper from stacks of reports. A coal fire burned low in the grate, its warmth barely reaching the corners of the room. The inspector leaned back in his chair, boots propped on the desk. "Clean case, Holmes," he said, exhaling a long plume of smoke. Edmund's confession came in the cells last night, full and detailed. He admits slipping the cyanide into the teapot while the women staged their ghost. Said he'd planned only to frighten Reginald into delaying the sale. But when the opportunity arose, he acted. The arsenic was from Thorne's collection. Edmund had bought it weeks earlier under another name, claiming historical interest. Holmes nodded, seated opposite, steepled fingers under his chin, and the loose ends? Cleared. Miss Clara and Eliza will face no charge beyond a caution for the deception. Youthful folly, not malice. Thorne's forgeries are a separate matter. He's cooperating fully, returning pieces where possible. The dagger itself, proven a fine Elizabethan copy, not royal, will remain in the family collection for now. Lady Victoria intends to donate several items to the nation in Reginald's memory. I felt the rough wool of the office chair against my back, contrasting the smooth leather of our own at Baker Street. The fire popped softly. Outside, hansom cabs clattered past, their wheels a steady rhythm on the cobbles. Lestrade tapped ash into a tray. "You saved us from a scandal, Holmes. Poisoned by the ghost of Anne Boleyn would have filled the penny papers for months. Instead, we have a straightforward, if sordid, tale of greed and poison." Holmes permitted himself a small, thin smile. The papers will still have their sensation. Brother against brother Tudor relics, a staged spectre. But the truth will bind it all. We left the yard as noon approached, the sun breaking weakly through high cloud, warming the damp pavements enough to raise faint steam. The air smelled cleaner now. No heavy fog, only the usual London mix of coal smoke, horse manure, and distant river mud. Holmes walked beside me in silence for some minutes, then spoke. "Every loose thread tied, Watson. The criminal bound by his own acts, and justice served without melodrama. Yet one always wonders, had Reginald yielded on the sale, would Edmund have stayed his hand?" I had no answer. We took a cab back to Baker Street, the familiar 17 steps welcoming us home. Inside, the fire crackled brightly. Mrs. Hudson had left fresh tea, steam rising against the window where sunlight now slanted through. I poured 2 cups, the hot liquid warming my palms against the lingering chill of the morning. Holmes sank into his chair, pipe finally lit, tobacco smoke curling upward in slow, thoughtful spirals. Looking back, the arrest had been almost quiet. No dramatic struggle, only the slow closing of iron links around a man who had thought himself cleverer than observation itself. The criminal bound. Justice served. Chapter 9. Links restored. The weeks following Lord Edmund's arrest passed in a quiet, methodical procession through the machinery of Victorian justice. The fogs of late autumn gradually thinned, giving way to sharper, frost-edged mornings, when the coal smoke rose in straight columns from chimneys, and the air carried a clean bite that stung the nostrils. At 221B Baker Street, the fire burned steadily, its crackle a constant companion to the rustle of newspapers and the soft clink of teacups. Mrs. Hudson moved about with renewed briskness, as though the resolution of the case had lifted some invisible weight from the house. The Old Bailey proceedings began on a chill December morning. The courtroom smelled of polished oak, old paper, and the faint, sour trace of the river that drifted in whenever the doors opened. Gas jets hissed along the high walls, casting steady light on the bewigged barristers and the jury box filled with solemn faces. Lord Edmund Hargrove stood in the dock, pale and diminished. The once imposing figure now stooped beneath the weight of his own actions. His counsel argued diminished responsibility, financial strain, family pressure, but the evidence Holmes had forged proved unyielding. The glove smudge, the timed absence, the cigar ash on the final note. The cyanide purchase traced to a false name but linked to Edmund's club habits. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice rang clear in the hushed room. Guilty. Edmund received sentence. Death commuted later to penal servitude for life after medical testimony on his mental state. As the black cap was set aside, a low murmur ran through the gallery. Lady Victoria sat rigid in the front bench, gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not weep, only nodded once to the judge before rising to leave. Outside, the cold cobblestones gleamed under weak winter sunlight. Hansom cabs waited in ranks, their horses stamping warm breath into the frosty air. With the verdict delivered, the innocent parties found their chains broken one by one. Miss Clara returned to her studies at a small women's college in Bloomsbury, her auburn hair now pinned with quiet determination rather than anxiety. She visited Baker Street one afternoon, bringing a slim volume of Tudor poetry as thanks. The room smelled of fresh tea and the faint lavender she still wore. Her voice was steady as she spoke. "I thought the past would haunt me forever," she said, her fingers tracing the smooth leather cover of the book. "But you showed me it was only one man's greed, not a family curse. I shall finish my research on the relics, properly this time, with truth as my guide." Eliza remained in service at the palace under Lady Victoria's protection. She had been cautioned but not charged. Her part in the apparition was judged youthful folly, not malice. When I called one December day to collect a forgotten notebook, she met me at the servants' entrance, apron crisp, hands no longer trembling. The small parlor smelled of carbolic and baking bread. A bright fire burned in the range. "I sleep better now, doctor," she told me softly. "No more white gowns, no more whispers in the attics. Sir Reginald would have forgiven me, I think. Lady Victoria has, too." Mr. Thorne's shop in Bloomsbury continued, though quieter. He had surrendered several forged pieces to the authorities, paid fines, and now dealt only in verified antiquities. When Holmes and I passed the window one evening, the bell tinkled as he waved us inside. The air was thick with old leather and clean ink. The grate crackled warmly. "I've learned my lesson, gentlemen," he said, polishing spectacles on a cloth. No more historical restorations for quick profit. The chain of truth holds firmer than any eye forged in deceit. Lady Victoria herself found a measure of peace. Kensington Palace's Tudor collection remained intact, augmented by several donations in Sir Reginald's name to the British Museum. She took up residence in a smaller house near Regent's Park, where the gardens smelled of damp earth and winter roses even in December. She wrote Holmes a brief, dignified note, gratitude for restoring honor to her husband's memory, and a promise that the relics would no longer be bartered for private gain. London itself seemed to exhale. The streets bustled once more with ordinary life. Hansom cabs clattering over cobbles, street sellers calling under gaslight, the distant toll of Big Ben marking hours without menace. The penny papers had moved on to newer scandals. The apparition of Anne Boleyn faded back into legend, mentioned now only in guidebooks as a picturesque tale rather than a fresh horror. One quiet evening in late December, Holmes and I sat by the fire at 221B. The room glowed with warmth. The coal crackled softly, tobacco smoke curled from his pipe, and the faint scent of Mrs. Hudson's mince pies drifted up from below. Outside, a light snow had begun, rare for London, flakes tapping gently against the panes like hushed applause. Holmes laid aside his violin, which he had been playing in slow, reflective phrases. "Order returns slowly, Watson," he said, watching the flames. "A chain broken in one place strains the whole fabric of society, yet mend one link, and the rest gradually realigns. Edmund bound himself. We merely revealed the fetters. Now the innocent walk free, the collection endures, and the palace stands quiet once more." I nodded, feeling the worn leather of my chair warm against my back. The hot tea in my hand tasted sweeter than usual, its steam rising in lazy spirals. Looking back over the weeks, I saw how each cleared name, each restored reputation, had quietly rebuilt the broken links. The streets of London, ever restless, had settled into their familiar rhythm. Order restored to London's streets. Chapter 10. By the fire at Baker Street. A soft January snow had fallen overnight, blanketing Baker Street in a rare hush that muffled the usual clatter of hansom wheels and street cries. At 221B, the coal fire burned bright and steady, its crackle filling the sitting room with warmth that pushed back the chill pressing against the frost-laced window panes. The air carried the comforting sense of strong tobacco from Holmes's pipe, the faint bitterness of fresh coffee Mrs. Hudson had left on the side table, and the sweet trace of brandy still lingering in the decanter. The gas jets hissed softly along the walls. The Stradivarius rested silent on its chair for once. Holmes sat in his usual armchair, long legs stretched toward the hearth, pipe drawing slowly. I occupied my own chair opposite, newspaper folded on my knee, feeling the worn leather warm against my back after the coal walk home from the Strand. The Morning Post had brought the last clippings of the case, brief, dignified notices of Edmund's commutation to life servitude, Clara's acceptance into advanced historical studies, and Lady Victoria's quiet donation of several Tudor pieces to the nation. The papers had moved on. The apparition of Kensington Palace was already fading into anecdote. Holmes set his pipe aside and steepled his fingers under his chin, eyes on the dancing flames. "A satisfactory conclusion, Watson. The chain is forged, tested, and laid to rest. Yet every such case invites reflection. On method, on observation, on the fragile veil deception casts over truth." I poured 2 small glasses of brandy. the liquid gleaming amber in the firelight, its sweet warmth spreading as I handed one to him. "You mean the chain method itself?" "Precisely." He accepted the glass, swirling it thoughtfully. "Every mystery begins as scattered observations. Footprints in dust, a scent of bitter almonds, a smudge on porcelain, a 20-minute gap in an alibi. Each is a link, cold and separate. The art lies not in finding them, but in forging connections. Logic as the hammer, reason as the anvil. One link alone proves nothing. Joined properly, they form an unbreakable chain that binds the guilty as surely as iron cuffs." He leaned forward slightly, voice low amid the fire's steady pop. "Consider this case beside the Hound of the Baskervilles. There, too, a spectral terror haunted the moors. A glowing hound howls in the night. Ancient curse. Superstition explained everything until we forged the chain. Phosphorescent paint on the beast's coat. A trained animal from South America. Boot prints matching a convict's peculiar gait. A hidden portrait revealing family resemblance. The glowing apparition was no demon, but human greed wielding chemistry and fear. Stapleton's design crumbled link by link. Once the paint was analyzed, the boot tracks measured, the portrait studied. Observation defeated deception because nature leaves traces. Man cannot help but leave more." Holmes paused, drawing again on his pipe, tobacco smoke curling upward in slow spirals to join the hearth's haze. "So here, the ghost of Anne Boleyn became a veil for poison. Yet every veil tears under scrutiny. The feminine footprints led to Eliza, the perfume to Clara, the gunpowder residue to staged flashes, the glove smudge and cigar ash to Edmund, timeline gaps, debt ledgers, overheard conversations, all links. When joined, they revealed not a restless spirit, but a desperate brother who borrowed a harmless prank and turned it lethal for inheritance." I sipped my brandy, tasting its rich sweetness against the faint bitterness of coffee still on my tongue. The fire crackled louder for a moment, sending sparks upward like tiny stars. "And why does observation so consistently defeat deception?" "Because deception requires effort to conceal, while truth requires none to reveal. The criminal must remember every detail, every footprint wiped, every note disguised, every absence accounted for. The honest observer need only look without prejudice. Data accumulates. The mind forges connections. Eliminate the impossible, ghosts wielding cyanide, and what remains, however improbable, is the human hand behind it all. That is the science of deduction, patient, relentless, impartial. It trusts neither legend nor alibi, only the silent testimony of things themselves." Holmes rose, paced once before the fire, then returned to his chair. His eyes gleamed with that peculiar light I had seen so often at the close of a chase. In every case, the pattern repeats. Boredom gives way to energy when the first link appears. Confusion yields to admiration as the chain grows. Triumph comes when it tightens, satisfaction when justice binds. And always, afterward, this quiet hour by the fire, reflecting on how fragile the veil truly is, how easily torn by a single, well-observed detail. He lifted his glass in a small salute. To the next puzzle, Watson. The world never lacks for chains waiting to be forged. I raised mine in return, feeling the warmth of the brandy and the fire mingle in my chest. Outside, the snow had ceased. Faint footsteps sounded on the pavement below, muffled by the thin white layer. London stirred on, its fogs and gaslights, its secrets and solutions ever renewing. Looking back across the months, I marveled at how blind I had been at first, how the links lay plain before me, yet only Holmes's mind had joined them into unbreakable logic. The science of deduction had prevailed once more, restoring order where greed had fractured it. Until the next chain forges, dear listener, the game continues.